second abroad to keep quiet on the same limited operation in a crocodile sanctuary. He survived, but when Sharma asked for protection from the authorities, dozens killed by sand mines. Victims include an 81-year-old teacher and a 22-year-old activist who were separately hacked to death, a journalist who was burned to death, and at least 3 police officers who were run over by sand trucks. In 2018, Sandeep Sharma, a reporter with a local television station in India, was run over by a sand truck after one police officer accepting a bribe to keep quiet on a sand mining operation in a crocodile sanctuary. He survived, but when Sharma asked for protection from the authorities, he was denied and forced to hand over the original recording to the police. Another victim, this time a special branch constable named Ron, was murdered for collecting intelligence at an illegal sand site. In 2012, French documentarian Sophie Bontemps and her crew were arrested for filming a sand mining operation in the hills of Morocco. Sophie was interrogated and her equipment was confiscated by authorities. Later that evening, a military colonel and 2 other officials arranged a mock trial in a hotel where the crew members were forced to release their footage. It was clear to the director that everyone, local workers, national officials, were not only involved in sand trafficking, but profiting. In her film, Morocco, Breaking on the Sand, in which the erased footage was restored from on-site backups and evidence of fame, local protesters were beaten and threatened. In June of 2019, Jose Luis Alvarez Flores, a Mexican environmental activist who protested illegal sand mining in the local river, was shot dead. When he was discovered, a note was also found threatening Flores' family and other activists. The illegal sand trade has become extremely profitable in a short time, not just for those participating in the trade, but for the politicians protecting the operations. As a matter of fact, I'm sure it's even more so beneficial for them. And like any high-demand industry prohibited by the government, the result is a robust black market that moves geopolitics as much as it does money. After all, land is often one of the most influential and important assets to the global economy. So what happens when one of the players can simply make more money? For a moment, let's consider a large, more powerful nation, China. Builders in the country all say it's soft gold, the trade of which skyrocketed in the 1980s during Shanghai's construction boom. China dredged its sand from the Yangtze River because it was the ideal for mixing up cement. By 2000, sand extraction had gotten so extreme, long stretches of sand collapsed. Same year, Korea's banned sand mining in the Yangtze altogether, but the trade continued illegally. During the day, these ships looked innocent enough, but at night, they would, quote, lower pipes to the riverbed and suck up thousands of tons of sand in a single session. In 2019, police seized over 300 sand dredging ships and enough sand to fill over 1,000 Olympic-sized swimming pools. A few years earlier, in the mid-2010s, when China was in full operation of its island enhancement program, the leaders of the other Southeast Asian nations came together to raise international concern over the country's Great Wall of Sand in the bottom area, the Spratly Islands. Located in the southern area of the South China Sea, Spratly claimed by several nations: China, Taiwan, Philippines, Malaysia, Brunei, and Vietnam. The islands consist of over 100 islets and reefs spread over 240,000 kilometers of ocean. Most vitally, the value this region has for maritime trade is enormous, specifically for Australia, as over 50% of Australian trade passes through the South China Sea, with, quote, $5 trillion in trade overall flowing through the region. These shipping sea lanes are not only important for trade in the region, but for food security as well. Around 10% of the world's fishing catch or harvest takes place in the South China Sea. China was originally left with smaller pieces of the Spratly Islands because it came late to the island occupation game. But through the sand trade, the country has been building and expanding these tiny pieces of land. The island building is, quote, an attractive option to add substance, literally, to China's physical presence among the disputed islands in the South China Sea. But it isn't just China. Singapore, which I'll remind you is the world's largest importer of sand, has seen similar geopolitical ramifications of the same trade. Since most of Singapore's reclaimed land sits across the ocean that once belonged to the Singapore Straits, separating it from Indonesia, the expansion demands new maritime boundaries every time new land is reclaimed. The consequences go beyond new lines drawn on the map, or loss of livelihoods due to participating in sufficient grounds. The erasure of these islands changes the entire seabed's natural defense against floods and tidal waves. Residents who once lived in the coastal communities on Bumasar Island after the island. As for Singapore's next door neighbor, Malaysia, every time Singapore's soil creeps into its waters, the country demands a reapportionment of territory and sea trade lanes between the two nations. But unlike the Spratly Islands dispute, which is regulated under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, Malaysia's is not. Singapore can legally reclaim sovereignty over its islands, reefs, and archipelagos. So Malaysia's demands to the newly exported territory holds no water. Holds no sand, I guess. This sets a highly dangerous precedent. Without regulations, a country's physical state can be eroded or expanded, shifting the paradigm of territorial expansion. Instead of war or colonialism, land reclamation allows what is essentially the legal growth of a country's territory through terraforming. Singapore isn't appropriating land by conquering nations in order to become larger, it's creating it from the water by shrinking the land somewhere else. I mean, think about the ramifications of this. If you want more to say in a local trade route, well, just expand your island out into the trade route enough that you have to make a new straight route. That means other nations have to pay you a tax. Just push the land out far enough that you cover up the waterway. Now you have to be paid to make a door through. It might seem odd that such a small country was playing this monumental of a role in the global arms race for land, but when you consider its history, it kind of makes sense. In 1890, Sir Stamford Raffles, British official in the colony of Singapore, wrote that its potential as a hub for the East India Company was, quote, fulcrum upon which empire shall grow, and thus would begin Singapore's narrative. The island would primarily function as a place for global trade and shipping. To this day, the country proudly markets itself to visitors as the world's gateway to Asia. Before British contact, Singapore was mostly marshland. Its indigenous population lived over on fishing and smuggling monsters. But in 1822, during Singapore's colonization, the country transformed from a fishing village to a port, which upended the natives' way of life and altered their environments by dredging mud from the marshes to lay the foundation for a harbor. Someone else might have been doing it, but it was Singapore's first land reclamation project. History has a way of repeating itself, but the notable difference, except the Custodes of the first transformation today, is the removal of its neighbors. The environmental degradation due to smuggling and its resulting sand war has strained ties between Singapore and the surrounding nations. But the most tragic component of the whole operation might be how Singapore's construction operates, through skilled foreign labor. The workers who are hired for the country's land reclamation projects are often Cambodians, Vietnamese, and Indonesians. Quote, the very same people whose communities live on or around disappearing islands and depleted marine life. These laborers are targets for predatory hiring practices, short-term jobs, low wages, and highly dangerous work. The tragic irony, of course, is that for every new Singaporean high-rise, these workers' homeland gets closer to extinction. The sand trade is systematic. The way that it financially benefits the countries, and the scale at which it operates is staggering. All evidence points to a future in which the illegal sand trade is here to stay, if for no other reason than the fact that the people who could stop it find it too important. Estimates of the sand war range, quote, from $200 billion to $350 billion per year, which is more than illegal logging, gold mining, and fishing combined. It's easy money for the sand market, as legal and illegal sand are exactly the same. This graph from 2017 shows that illegal sand extraction and trade had the third highest value of transnational crime based on dollars. It sits right behind counterfeiting and drug trafficking. Sand mining is dangerous and physically exhausting work. Most of these areas have already been exploited by previous mining operations, so divers have to plunge deeper into the riverbed to extract goods. On these riverbeds, sand is scooped into buckets which are pulled up by a boat. and as a result, the risk of drowning is especially high. The danger of the job demands that sand miners often earn more than their average counterparts in their country, making it a valid career path despite the illegality. With a very low barrier of entry, some officials at the local level, for example, quote, turn a blind eye to small-scale mining, seeing it as a way of allowing poor villagers to build affordable housing. Due to the nature of the work, sand mining operators are usually armed. Rival sand mafias present their own threats, as well as those to the miners' livelihoods, which come from local farmers and even journalists who might expose their work. More often than not, as the scale of small-time sand dredging increases, so does the likelihood for a sand mafia to emerge. It's the natural evolution of organized crime. We saw something similar happen in the world of illegal fishing off the coast of West Africa, when wildlife poaching drew criminal groups that eventually grew into illegal mining operations. If we use that framework for sand mining in Southeast Asia, the blueprint is already laid out. Weaker governments, easy entry to regional markets, and corrupt international corporations working together to create lucrative business opportunities. All of this is compounded by the reality that the demand for sand is unyielding. Singapore has remained particularly impervious to any legal action or punishment compared to the countries that sell its sand. In doing research for this video, it felt like most articles and media reports focused on the environmental and socioeconomic effects of sand dredging in Malaysia, Indonesia, and Cambodia, but Singapore's response deserves scrutiny as well. In 2010, when Singapore's government was asked by Global Witness what its role was in sand imports, the government said, quote, the import of sand to Singapore is done on a commercial basis. The Singapore government is not a party to any agreement or contract for the import of sand, essentially claiming plausible deniability by saying, hey, we've got nothing to do with it, and if it is happening, I haven't heard about it. However, this statement contradicts the discussions the government had in Parliament when the need to stockpile construction materials was brought up so the country's domestic markets were stable should a shock occur in the supply chain or disrupted trade routes due to potential geopolitical tensions. One official said that the government would help contractors by, quote, co-sharing up to 75% of the price increases in sand and granite. This offer to share a portion of the cost with contractors directly disputes the Singaporean government's original statement of saying it doesn't purchase any sand itself. It's the government going from saying they're not buying any sand, it's all private businesses, to, well, we know sand's coming in, so we'll help you pay for it. Another contradiction was found by Global Witness when the government website showed tenders that were issued by the Housing and Development Board for the acquisition of sand for various development projects. In other words, more evidence of the government knowing of sand coming in, despite saying otherwise. But the biggest contradiction to Singapore's claim that they have no involvement in the import of sand was discovered in a contract from JGC, the country's government agency under the Ministry of Trade and Industry. Global Witness says this contract was explicitly for the purchase of sand by JGC from an informed company. Global Witness even found that some of the sand dredging licenses from Cambodia had the stamp of a Singaporean official. Singapore then, it would seem, considers its government boards to be separate entities from the government, or at least that might be how they justify their position. By employing multiple layers of contractors, Singapore is able to hide its own responsibility and role in the corruption of other Southeast Asian countries. Basically, I'm not doing the crime, I just have a guy that does the crime for me, but it's not me doing it, so I don't know. Allegedly, I guess. Can Singapore sue me? Probably. Allegedly. It's a systematic loophole to keep Singapore from legal recourse and liability. And despite the country's claims that appropriate policies are in place to ensure ethical sand mining, there is very little regulation in the regional and international context. In fact, an intergovernmental organization called ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, promotes non-intervention in business relations among ASEAN states. In other words, the bodies that regulate these kind of things are just going to let the nation do it. I'm sure they'll both come to this conclusion. Very little is known regarding policies that outline the terms and conditions these states agree to when operating these kind of projects. Not the question is the officials who, when asked, just maintain that sand mining from the country's neighbors is not sustainable. In 2021, when the Minister of National Development was asked if environmental studies about Singapore's sustainable mining practices could be made public, They responded that the studies, which guide plan and land reclamation and mitigate environmental impact, were confidential due to, quote, overriding security considerations. That's right. And they were asked to show their work that they say is the reason they are able to sustainably mine for sand. They said we can't show you that work because security concerns or something. Hey, it's that piece of paper that explains how this mining stuff is ethical, nothing is a bad thing. Oh, yes, please. Can I see it? No. What the minister failed to mention was exactly what these standards were and what constitutes the overriding security considerations, as environmental standards are not publicly released. Singapore's biggest offense, however, is that it calls itself a, quote, leader in the region for sustainable development, despite the negative impacts the country's demand for sand has caused to its neighbors. Which, yes, I'm sure they are sustaining Singapore. Nothing else. Singapore's thirst for sand is now to the point where it looks beyond Southeast Asia. In addition to sand sources in Philippines, Myanmar, and Bangladesh, it's reported to have set its sights on the shrine of Guinea. Reading accounts detail, quote, Singaporean company is working to get approval to mine a 50-kilometer stretch of beach on the north coast of Guinea. This stretch of coast is protected habitat for endangered leatherback sea turtles. Unless major government regulation is implemented, Papua New Guinea is destined to a similar fate to Indonesia and Cambodia. As legal above-board sand mining operations look to expand globally, is it even possible to stop these sand mafias that follow? Only time will tell. But we're betting that the answer will be a resounding no. I mean, anytime someone wants to get something the legal way, someone is going to find a way to get it the illegal way. In recent years, Singapore has adjusted its sand importing strategies as a result of public criticism and scrutiny. The government announced plans to reduce dependence on imported sand and adopt a new reclamation method called integrity. This involves, quote, building a dike around the area of the sand plant and then draining water from the area to create a patch of land that lies below sea level. Singapore also announced it would look into sand substitutes such as recycled materials for construction. Ideas like floating cities, which are being tested in Japan, are also something Singapore is considering and building technologies for. Its development plans are still focused on land flow. Perhaps if legalities won't stop the sand trade, advancements in technology will. 3 years ago, according to Scientific American, quote, researchers from several universities demonstrated an optical system that can fingerprint sand grains, allowing them to be traced back to their site of origin. This new technology will be used to help distinguish imported sand's origins from legal or illegal operations. This would at least make the illegal sand trade harder, as there would be a way to check the customs. Other technologies include making desert sand useful for construction projects by putting an additive in it to make it stronger. While these announcements and technological advancements point towards a more sustainable future for Singapore sand demands, in 2024, Indonesia lifted its ban on sand exports and allowed sea sand dredging. The reason they dropped the rules after all this time? Indonesian policymakers went back to the sand trade. Other countries looking to boost their GDP are likely to follow with their bans as well. As long as sand remains a foundational piece of Singapore's development, the incentive for smuggling also remains. The illegal sand trade and its connected sand mafia have already proven difficult. Black margins, corruption, and uneven governance contribute to its thriving existence. This black market is driven by Singapore's sand and the rise of multi-billion-dollar smuggling. Adding in lack of environmental oversight, Singapore is responsible for the shipping of sand's coastlines, geopolitical tensions between its neighboring regions, a healthy criminal underground, and a trail of second as well. But it doesn't just limit to Singapore. Not only is sand used for construction, but it is, quote, a key ingredient in the microprocessors and memory chips used in nearly all computer technology. Sand is the most wanted raw material on the planet, and Singapore's addiction is just a microcosm of a global issue. And while the United States has had a history of sand mining, there are more federal and state agencies that help regulate it compared to Southeast Asia, India, and Africa. The Sandman, mythical character used in many children's stories who brings sleep-inducing sand, dreams. It's now a name. It's a reality that bears no allegiance to any nation. It's as borderless and liquid as money, chipped from the highest bidder. As we've seen with Malaysia, Indonesia, India, and Vietnam, there is no more land. only more sand. And that is the story of Singapore's and a lot of the world's sand molecules. Again, so much money being traded, so many lives being lost, and countries literally being reformed over something that most of us probably don't give a second glance to. Sand. As with any other resource in the world, if someone wants something and someone else is willing to sell it, legal or otherwise. But all in all, I believe this to be a fascinating, if lesser known, international smuggling trade. Hopefully you found interesting as well. If you did, I think that's really cool. We just want to say thank you for watching. One of the most interesting aspects of this story to me were those initial journalists who wrote this story in the first place. Like, it's one thing to sit here and talk about what other people have figured out, but to be one of the first people who started to figure this out and then be like Sophie, the French documentarian who was captured and had all her footage deleted and managed to recover, put the story out. Those people are heroes. Work like that certainly deserves to be remembered. No matter how hard the work is, there's always things like that that are worth shining for. But hopefully you guys enjoyed this topic. I certainly did. Everyone who made this video possible will be credited in the description. Be sure to show them some appreciation. New videos here, you guys can pay videos as always. The G channel will be here. And then videos going up like once or twice a month, whatever. Lunch. Check those out if you have nice new content way, as always. And I believe that should do it for now. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye. With the whole sand fingerprint system I talked about earlier, where they can determine if the sand came from a legal or illegal source, what would be the penalty? Like, if you catch someone with a cargo check for illegal sand, is it like, okay, you're going to jail, or is it like a certain amount of parts per million illegal to legal sand you can have? How does that translate to my kid's sandbox? If I pour illegal sand, do I go to jail, or do we both have the case? I guess there's only one way to find out.
but
Random Latin digit. History's most one-sided wars. History's most one-sided wars. There's that quote about all being fair in love and war, but I don't think that someone swinging their sword at an Ordnance BL 5-inch howitzer artillery cannon would find it very fair. Well, that's pretty much what happened during the Battle of Omdurman. Now, if you're familiar with African history around the turn of the 20th century, you know that it was nothing short of a shit show. European powers were grabbing anything and everything they could get their hands on to see what natural resources could be tapped into. As for the British, one of their more tactical moves was seizing control of the Egyptian territory from the Ottoman Empire in the late 1880s. Why Egypt? Well, because Egypt has the Suez Canal. It's basically a super sweet shortcut connecting the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea, and thus the Indian Ocean. Guess who owned India at the time? Also the British. So instead of slogging the freshly plundered raw materials all the way around the scenic circumference of Africa, merchants could just speedrun that shit through the Suez, potentially saving months of sailing. Now, with the seizure of Egypt came a bit of a bonus. Some territory to the south, known as Sudan. But it came with some baggage of its own. If Egypt were to be the crisp, clean shirt in the deal, Sudan was going to be the pants. And these pants were about to be shed. So while the British now controlled Sudan on paper, it wasn't really the case in reality. At least not yet. Throwing even more chaos into the mix were the not-so-modest Mahdists, an independent Islamic group that rose up and rebelled against their Ottoman Egyptian oppressors, establishing their own state in the Sudanese territory back when the Ottomans controlled the region just a decade earlier. They didn't give a flying flip that the British were now the technical rulers of the land. Oppressors were oppressors. As a matter of fact, they were feeling a bit big in the britches after just toppling the Ottoman control, so they were eager to start round two. The British, though, initially wanted to abandon Sudan, declaring it too much of a political and financial burden to deal with, what with all the squabbling and whatnot. They would instead leave the Mahdists to have their own land and not intervene. However, continued Mahdist aggression led to the death of one Charles Gordon, a renowned British general who was tasked with evacuating civilians from the Sudanese spit-sounding capital city of Khartoum. Mahdist soldiers slaughtered around 10,000 innocent civilians in their wake of Charles's assassination. This single act switched British opinion from indifference to vowing vengeance. Thus, in 1896, the British began the Anglo-Egyptian conquest of Sudan. This war lasted about 3 years, with British forces steamrolling the Mahdists in virtually every encounter. Well, if it's so one-sided, why did it take 3 years? Good question. This was actually by design. You see, the British were slowly advancing into Sudan, building a supply railroad behind them the whole way, so as to not have supplies run dry and be caught with their pants down, an issue that had previously plagued the British in the past. The conquest culminated in the Battle of Omdurman on September 2nd, 1898. Oof, just lasting a single day, huh? Talk about foreboding. Yeah, so this battle wasn't so much of a battle as it was a full-blown massacre. Here's where the one-sidedness kicks in. About 26,000 British and Egyptian troops faced off against over 50,000 Sudanese warriors. Seems like a slam dunk for Sudan, but sheer size is no match for optimal equipment. Remember that supply railway I just mentioned? Well, it supplied the British front lines with 17,000 rolling block rifles, 8,000 bolt-action rifles, 44 artillery cannons, and 40 state-of-the-art water-cooled Maxim automatic machine guns. Oh yeah, there was also a handful of naval gunboats ready to tear shit up from the banks of the Nile. The Mahdists, well, you know, they tried. They had several thousand firearms seized from previous battles, as well as a few dozen artillery, but yeah, they were either poorly maintained or those operating them were poorly trained. The unlucky fellas not equipped with firearms instead brandished the old-reliable sword and shield, and it went just about as well as you'd think. The Mahdists were completely and utterly destroyed. According to 23-year-old British Lieutenant Winston Churchill, yes, that Winston Churchill, approximately 11,000 Mahdist soldiers lay dead, 16,000 wounded, and over 4,000 captured. The rest either surrendered or just fled. As for the British, less than 50 soldiers were killed in battle, a testament to the sheer imbalance of weapons technology and tactical warfare. After the battle, the Mahdist state was effectively dismantled, cementing British dominance in Sudan. Sometimes wars can be won without inflicting any real damage. You just have to be well versed in the art of intimidation. Even if you're a tiny pushover, you can still get your way if you make yourself seem scary enough. The Kettle War is a prime example of this tactic. At the end of the 80 Years' War back in 1648, the Dutch gained independence from the Spanish. In addition to establishing their own little republic within the Netherlands, the Dutch had full access to a gaping mouth. The mouth of the Scheldt River. This was a critical trade route for many cities just south of the newly formed republic. Cities that were still under smelly Spanish control. So the Dutch took advantage of the situation. Oh yeah, time to close the river. The Dutch cut off all trade access to the Scheldt, completely crippling the economies of the downstream cities. Instead, trade was diverted through the Dutch ports of Amsterdam and Rotterdam, allowing them to flourish into dominant trade hubs. The funny thing though, nothing would be done about it for 136 years. But in the late 1700s, there was a new sheriff in town for the Holy Roman Empire, Joseph II, and he did not like the Dutch doing what they were doing. As a rather ambitious reformer, he was aiming to make his empire the main political and economic power in Europe. But the whole closure of the Scheldt thing was a big old turd in the punch bowl of his plans, so he needed to act. And act he did. Having just gotten their struts kicked in by the British during the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War in 1784, Joseph II decided to take advantage of a now weakened Dutch republic. The demand was simple: open up the river or go to war. Now, when your territory is like this, and another territory threatening you looks like this, it might be best to just let them have this one. In reality, however, the Holy Roman Empire's army was fairly scattered across the mainland, being particularly small and ill-equipped near the Netherlands, so the immediate threat was minimal at best. As a show of force, though, and to keep up the illusion of strength, Joseph sent out a small squadron of 3 naval warships, led by the heavily armed, no-nonsense heaven flagship Le Louis. The ships were sent to the mouth of the Scheldt to sit there and look intimidating. The Dutch, however, called the empire out on their bluff. On October 9, 1784, they intercepted the 3 opposing warships with one of their own, the Dolphin, and it was looking to blow some holes into other ships. In an act of intimidation of their own, the Dolphin fired a single warning shot towards Le Louis. A soup in the morning, a soup at night, a soup every day makes me feel right. Oh man, now I'm super depressed. The warning shot from the Dolphin whizzed through the galley of Le Louis, causing the casualty of a single soup kettle. Hilariously, the crew of Le Louis surrendered immediately, chalking up a victory for the Dutch Republic with a single cannon shot. Joseph II, not to be embarrassed, declared full-on war, but no violence ever came of it. Instead, both agreed to negotiate. The result? The Scheldt remained closed, but the Dutch would compensate the Holy Roman Empire a hefty sum for the inconvenience. Around 2 to 10 million Dutch guilder, or roughly $120 to $600 million in today's money. I'd say that compensates for the soup. War and drugs is a pretty solid combination, but when said substances are used in warfare, then it becomes a whole other matter entirely. Let's touch back on the early 1800s. Despite being halfway around the world, the British Empire still commanded trade in the Indian Ocean, even stretching into the Pacific, with one of their main suppliers being Imperial China. The Qing dynasty was doling out all kinds of goods to the Brits, including earthy herbs, soft silks, precious porcelain, and the iconic British life fuel, tea. While this trade was good for the British consumer, the rather one-sided trade imbalance left British merchants a tad miffed. The British Empire was absolutely hemorrhaging silver to pay for all of the goods with no reciprocity. The Chinese simply had little to no interest in British goods like wool or cotton. And that was a problem as British silver reserves were drying up, putting a damper on the liquidity of trade in the region. So, what do you do if there's no demand? You force it. The British began secretly exporting Indian-grown opium into Chinese ports. Smugglers paid for the opium with silver, which then paid for more Chinese goods, completing a more sustainable trade loop. British merchants were happy, Chinese smugglers were happy, the majority of the Chinese population were suffering crippling addiction. You know how it goes. So yeah, it's no surprise that opium demand soon turned exponential. From 1797 to 1833, opium imports soared from 680,000 pounds a year to over 5.1 million pounds a year. I mean, it was a silver gold mine. Even American merchants got in on the action, selling Turkish opium to China. But this started to tip the scales too far in the other direction, now with the Chinese silver reserves reaching unsustainable levels, not to mention the effects on the general population. Before, the average British consumer was just sipping their Chinese tea from ornate porcelain cups while relaxing in their comfy silk robes. Now, the average Chinese consumer was struggling to detach themselves from a pipe. Although the Chinese emperor had outright banned opium usage, it didn't stop the average fella from getting their fix. Millions upon millions were addicted, leading to a drastic decline in productive laborers, merchants, farmers, and teachers. Well, in 1839, the Chinese emperor put his silky slippered foot down. Severe punishments were put in place for anyone dabbling in deals of opium. All imports of the stuff were seized and destroyed. Famously, the kickstart of the Opium War was the seizure and destruction of over 2.9 million pounds of opium in one go. The British were not pleased with getting shafted out of payment for the product, so they demanded reparations. A cannon point. Just a year later in 1840, a British naval fleet positioned itself off of China's eastern coast and began bringing the heat, bullying various islands into submission as to establish a base of operations. Let's take a look at the roster for both sides. The British in this campaign commanded over 19,000 soldiers and 37 ships. Standing in China's corner, though, was an estimated 100,000 mobilized infantry. China had the numbers, but Britain had the technology. Chinese fortresses demolished. Resistance groups destroyed. Innocent civilian generational homesteads deleted. Campaigning up the Pearl River, the British blasted their way to the Chinese commercial heart of Canton, still hell-bent on getting their compensation. Sir, the British are here. Both parties sat down at a pretty cool-looking table and agreed to peace terms. But the overarching powers in charge, mainly the Qing Emperor and the British Foreign Secretary, refused said terms, prompting the supersaturated British to withdraw from the Pearl and shoot up the Yangtze River to clog any and all economic arteries. This forced China to renegotiate the peace conditions, resulting in the drafting of the Treaty of Nanjing in 1842. As a result, opium usage remained illegal, but new trade ports would be open to British imports, which, hilariously enough, was still royal shit tons of opium. The island of Hong Kong was ceded to the British as a colony, and China was forced to pay nearly 26 million silver dollars in reparations to the British. This comes out to roughly $830 million in purchasing power, or roughly $1.3 billion in silver value alone. Now, there was a second opium war a few decades later, but just like a bunch of farmers winning 2 donkey auctions, the Chinese got their asses handed to them a second time. This one's a classic. Now, I briefly ran through this one in my History Facts You Wouldn't Believe Are True video, but let's revisit it with a deeper understanding and some better artwork. The Anglo-Zanzibar War holds the record as the shortest war in known human history, lasting just 38 minutes. I mean, your commute home is probably longer than that. You're listening to D101 The Shaft. All other radio stations can suck a dick. The reasoning behind the war was very simple. By the end of the 1800s, Zanzibar was a major trade hub off the eastern coast of Africa. Whoever controlled it had massive influence in the region's exchange of goods, including spices, ivory, and the frequent slave or two, including all profits that go with it. With European powers scrambling for Africa, Britain needed to cement its ability to control trade, hence the discussion about it taking Egypt in the first chapter. But Zanzibar was also unethically up for grabs. A treaty was signed in 1890, and the nation of Zanzibar, while remaining independent, became a British protectorate, meaning that the British technically held power over Zanzibar, but it could self-govern with guaranteed British protection should things go awry. On August 25, 1896, the British Empire's favorite sultan, along with his esteemed beard, received a sudden and premature ticket to paradise. Some believe he may or may not have been poisoned, but no proof has ever surfaced to support that claim. What's suspicious, though, is that the sultan's less impressive facial hair-having cousin, Khalid bin Bargash, decided to claim the throne for himself while the previous sultan's body was still warm. Oh, and fun fact, this same guy lost out on the throne just 3 years prior. Highly suspicious, one might say, fingering their mustache. Unfortunately for Khalid, only a British-approved sultan could sit on the throne. Unfortunately for the British, he didn't give a fuck. In case you didn't know, the name Khalid in Arabic means immortal or everlasting, a name that was about to be put to the test using multiple British gunboats just strapped to the tits with cannons and machine guns. On August 26th, the very next day after the Sultan had just died, Khalid was given an ultimatum: surrender by 9 a.m. the next morning or be converted into a fine red mist. Khalid refused, not believing that the British had the balls to actually do anything about it. As a precaution, he had assembled a small army of his own, including a few outdated cannons and guns, but the comparison of firepower was laughable. Multiple warnings were given to the usurper the next morning, up until an hour before the deadline. However, the warnings fell on deaf ears. The clock struck the hour, 9 a.m. The air was still with a deafening silence so quiet, you could hear a subscribe button click. The order was given. The gunboats unleashed their volleys on the Sultan's palace for 38 minutes. Suffice to say, it was completely destroyed. After the guns fell silent, over 500 men and women, mostly innocent civilians, lay dead. The British suffered only one injury, a simple splinter from flying debris. As for Khalid, he snuck off into hiding but was eventually captured and exiled. That afternoon, the British placed a new approved sultan in place, and within a few weeks, a new palace was built. A happy ending for most. This episode of Chat History is called Emu Wool. Listen, I know the subject has been beaten to death worse than a wife at an alcoholics convention, but now it's my turn. Back in 1932, the inverted hellhole that is Australia had one heck of a problem. After the Great War, returning veterans needed something to help them cope with the fact that they just lived through the most traumatic event of their lives, so far. In order to supply such a remedy, the Australian government encouraged returning veterans to settle on remote farmland out west. This relaxing, freeing, open-air experience hypothetically would do the mind and body good for the recovering war heroes. But with a lack of farming experience and putting said low-level farmers in less than ideal agricultural conditions, it became way more of a burden than a life of leisure. Oh yeah, and that Great Depression thing was going on. What, you thought that was just a United States thing? No. It was a worldwide catastrophe. To throw even more salt in the wound, wheat prices were taking a pounding. So not only was it a pain to grow, but yielding any wheat, ironically enough, wasn't netting much bread. But then comes the main villain of the story. With environmental, mental, and financial odds stacked against them, the Aussies faced one more foe. The dreaded emu. Actually, it was more like 20,000 emus. A massive mob of the flightless birds had migrated from more central regions of the outback towards the west in search of cooler temperatures and more fruitful areas for public domestication. Unfortunately for the aspiring farmers, such a source of sustenance was their main cash crop, the wheat. The emus swarmed the farmlands, consuming everything in their way. So the farmers phoned the government. Oi, government! These rot cunts are eating on me crops! The news spread quickly, making it all the way up to the Minister of Defense, who approved a military intervention to deal with the pest problem. The solution? A few lead pills administered through an ergonomic dispenser. They were going to shoot them. Deployed onto the field were 2 Lewis lead machine guns with approximately 10,000 rounds and a military vehicle for mobility. The basic idea was to scare off the flocks and send them back where they came from, or at least somewhere that wasn't farmland. But things, of course, didn't go according to plan. To make up for the fact that they're flightless, emus are extreme sprinters, capable of topping out at around 30 miles an hour. Also keep in mind that emus can stand as tall as 6.5 feet and weigh over 130 pounds. So these feather balls of rage were no pushovers. Brought up, let's open her up. The emus were slippery little devils, able to weave in and out of the gunfire pretty effectively. They ran around all over the place, tearing up crops in the process. But the real kick in the dick here is that they refused to relocate away from their newfound food source. After a few weeks, only a few hundred emus were slain, barely a dent in the total population. So the government tried again, improving ambush tactics and rallying locals to help out. They were way more successful, bringing the kill count to about 1,000. Still only about 5% of the estimated population. The Australian government threw in the towel, with the public deeming the operation a waste of government resources amidst a global economic crisis. Despite staring down the barrel of a machine gun, the emus were declared the victors, for now. In addition to erecting more effective fencing, the government turned to the everyday citizen for help. providing free or subsidized ammo for some good old-fashioned giant bird hunting. Within just 6 months, over 50,000 bounties have been claimed and paid out. And over the next few decades, this number grew to nearly 300,000. Looks like meat's back on the menu, boys. These idiots always forget the lampshades. Well, that sucks. Looks like you are in for another round of survival, but hey, maybe the witch wasn't part of this one, right? Right, so let's see what you're made of. I'm gonna go narrate from a safe distance. Good luck. Alright, so first you're gonna need to assess any immediate damage and take stock of what you have. Or you could panic and make hasty decisions instead. See what happens when you panic? Now, take a deep irradiated breath and just think for a second here. Judging by the fact that the nuclear plant is like right there, it's safe to say that you're well within the danger zone. But that cheaper house price is worth it. Your immediate and best move is to go back into your house and shelter in place since you know that there's at least some food and water there. Make sure all of your windows and doors are sealed shut to keep out any unwanted radiation and or people. Desperate times create desperate people. Also, try to stay in the center of your house or bunker down in a basement. You might also want to take the time to contact those you care about. Oh wait, in this hypothetical scenario, you're a complete loner who doesn't have much in the ways of loved ones. Except your buddy Ron, but you never invite him over. Oh well, the less people you have in your life, the less you have to be concerned about in an emergency situation. Who needs loved ones? Not you. Hypothetically, of course. Also, your phone has no signal thanks to extreme network congestion and flock convenient factors. They never work when you need them to. Speaking of people, be glad you're not out in that traffic jam. They're about to learn a thing or two about nuclear fallout. See, when a nuclear source detonates, that explosion will vaporize and launch a bunch of stinky radioactive material out over yonder. Fallout can come in many flavors, ranging from small sand-like particles to large heavy debris and even a mediocre franchise. Either way, this stuff is deadly. Any form of contact will likely result in radiation burn. What's radiation? It's just traveling energy. Heat from the sun? Radiation. Wi-Fi? Radiation. Your buddy Raymond from Japan? Radiation. These examples, though, are considered low-energy radiation, also known as non-ionizing radiation, meaning that they aren't strong enough to cause any physical harm, except red. Nuclear radiation, however, can, and it will. You can think of high-energy or ionizing radiation as a bunch of itty-bitty fists just penetrating your soft, vulnerable body and beating the ever-loving crap out of your internal molecules, particularly your DNA. Now here's a lesson for you. Your DNA is your genetic information, passed on to you through many generations. Your mom, your dad, your grandparents too. Some from Emo Mary and the balls of Grandpa Lou. Looking like a ladder with a big old twist, it's pretty complicated, but you'll get the gist. All these little rungs determine all your bits. Brown eyes, quick wits, thick thighs, and nice tits. Are you breathing with a heave? Maybe flicking with a thick? Then thank you DNA for all the heavy lifting. Adenine for A, cytosine for C. Guanine is your G and thymine is your T. With the C to the G and the T to the A that keeps you alive at the end of the day. Now, if this rhyme made your dopamine spike, then hit that subscribe or at least give a like. Thank you. Anyway, if you leave yourself unprotected, then all that high energy radiation comes in and just gives your DNA a wet form, severing them critical bonds and altering your genetic code, which will more or less lead to developmental issues and cancer down the road. One positive about nuclear fallout is that its radioactivity decays very fast. According to the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, within the first 7 hours, the fallout has already lost 90% of its dose rate of radiation. If you wait a full 48 hours, that increases to 99%. Sure, I wouldn't advise making dust angels in it, but it's better than what happened to those traffic jam people. Or souls. The point is, patience and planning will get you through this. Ooh, looks like you got company. Yo, dude, Ron, open up. The mysterious voice at the door, as he just identified himself, is Ron. He's your best and only friend going on 4 years now ever since you both wore that same shirt at that one bar at that one time. Bro. Yeah, guy friendships are that simple. Now, Ron, he's always had this weird obsession with end-of-the-world scenarios like this, so I'm sure he will use this situation as a big ol' I told you so. I told you so. See? Of course I had to invite myself over, but dude, we gotta get a move on. It's been a few weeks with Ron, and things are going pretty well. Luckily, with like 3/4 of the population dying in gridlock, resources are still pretty plentiful. You both managed to hunker down at a grocery store, which is conveniently constructed next to a home improvement facility. That's pretty neat. But let's face it, humans are opportunists. So if there's chaos and confusion, people will take advantage. Sure, some looting and stuff happened, but oddly enough, the majority of things taken were TVs and shoes. That's lucky for you, since those things are, as far as I know, inedible. Sure, you figured that the government might have helped out by now, but the emergency services budget has been diverted to researching the long-term effects of as-been-filled political commentary. There's not much for wiggle room. Yeah, this is going to keep getting worse. As for food, you want to prioritize anything that is sealed, especially with high water content, as they are the least likely to be affected by radiation, since radiation can't swim. Things like canned meats, canned vegetables, and oh no way, they even have... Since this grocery store has backup generators, refrigerated and frozen foods are still on the menu. If you can figure out a way to safely cook them, of course. Uh-oh, looks like the store manager isn't too happy about you fingering his foods. Time for a choice. What's a plumber's favorite drug? Huh? You said you were gonna... Ron, do you think we're gonna make it out of here? Of course, dude. Why do you ask? I just think we should be making progress away from here. Away from all this chaos and this radiation. Sure, it's all radioactive out there. Actually, all the radiation is being blown northwest of here. As long as you keep to the southeast for a few hundred miles, you should be good. So why haven't you left? Do you really care? No. Well, you probably want radiation suits like these ones, just in case though, but these are for me and my son here. Can we have those? Hell no. Please? No, okay. Nice work. You managed to figure out a way to safety, but you can't go unprepared. You're gonna need to find some equipment for the journey ahead. You should be your way over to the hardware place next door to look for supplies. With some luck, you're able to find some cloth, 3 logs, and a rope. With some elbow grease and a bit of know-how, you're able to craft these into something useful. That should work. You also grab a sweet axe as a precaution, placing all of the items in your back pocket to save precious time and animation. You ready to go, Ron? Let's do it. Oh, that needs some WD-40. Yep. You traverse through the remnants of the town and make your way towards the southeast. On your way, you pass by dozens of poor unfortunate souls who have succumbed to the effects of radiation poisoning. This stuff is not fun in the slightest. If your unprotected body gets absolutely assaulted by ionizing radiation, you're in for a world of hurt. Literally. I'm sure you're familiar with the famous Chernobyl nuclear disaster in 1986. The firefighters and operators during that event learned very quickly that death can be an invisible beast. After generous exposure to radiation emanating from the nuclear reactor core, these men endured unfathomable pain and suffering for weeks. Immediate symptoms included radiation burns, intense nausea and vomiting, headaches, and diarrhea. Those that could be were rushed to the Pripyat hospital, where they had to be stripped of their contaminated clothes that continued to bombard their bodies with radiation, even while being miles from the original source. Those clothes were abandoned in the hospital's basement and are still down there emitting levels of radiation to this day, albeit not nearly as dangerous. Over the following weeks, these men's bodies severely deteriorated, forming painful burns and bleeding blisters with extreme hair loss and a constant state of confusion and dizziness. In the end, 28 firefighters who responded to the Chernobyl disaster died of acute radiation syndrome. But there's nothing cute about being turned into a human hemorrhoid. Now luckily, you're past the point of this being a problem for you. It's probably best if you trail off from the beaten path. After all, you never know if any of the other survivors you encounter will be friend or foe. You trek through the woods for a few days, living off of various non-perishables and borrowed water from your convenient off-screen inventory. But supplies are starting to run a bit low, and you think you might need to start foraging. Hold on. Remember that nuclear contamination can spread far beyond the original site, even if it isn't directly downwind. So animals, plants, and water sources can still be contaminated. So unless you carry a reverse osmosis filtration plant between your cheeks, you're SOL. Looks like you need to search elsewhere for food and water. But it also looks like Rock is about to be in danger. Oh, look at this little fella. You gotta come over here and take a look at this little powder puff. He's so dang cute. Ron? What? Oh, shit. There! A cave! Bears hate caves! Good enough for me. You might want to hurry up a bit. We made it. You okay, Ron? Ron? Are you okay? Take the time to mourn the loss of your fallen friend. The solid silence is broken by a noise deeper in the cave. You even notice some light, and are determined to investigate. Now, under normal circumstances, you really shouldn't be wandering willy-nilly into a cave like this. It's a surefire way to end up trapped or wedged in some narrow cave system dubbed Satan's Prolapse. But there is an angry bear outside that just murdered your friend, so this might be a better alternative. Let's see what lies ahead. Hello? 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 I hate cultists. Well, that was certainly a choice. Looks like you're the new owner of a weird little worshipping cave. There's some sweet loot here. You scavenge and swipe what you can. Some food, materials, but something else catches your eye. Well, that's definitely magical, but certainly evil. And there's an inscription underneath. Survival you have learned, so now you must return. Just flip me thrice, but some advice, that witch will need to burn. Are you really gonna trust some evil artifact you just found in a cultist's cave? Well, why not? Well, you. I'm back. Hey, Cityville nuclear power plant? We have a witch problem. No, this isn't a prank. Hey, Ron, do you want to come over? The worst jobs in history. If you ever think your job's crappy, try having to plunge into a pit of literal human doo-doo feces every single night. Way back in the day in good old England, some daring men made a career out of wading through human excrement. So-called gong farmers were tasked with draining out cesspits filled to the brim with offensive butt slime. The profession had existed for centuries, but it saw its height between the years of 1485 and 1603, also known as the Tudor era. Since this was way before the invention of the toilet, people were content with just slamming their cheeks down in a public latrine to pinch off a quick loaf. The other problem was the lack of availability of somewhere to go. Towards the end of the 14th century, it's estimated that there was only one public bathroom per 2,000 people. Plus, keep in mind that all of that human waste was just piling up in a literal stone-lined hole in the ground, so you were just dropping logs onto a mountain of timber. The local government, realizing that this horrid threat to public health was fermenting beneath everyone's feet, took action to allow the construction of private outhouses and latrines in residential areas as a way to disperse the smelly sewage. It didn't work all that well. So, with dookie levels rising, help was needed to drain the pits. Enter the gong farmer. The term gong deriving from an Old English term meaning to go. They were also referred to as the much more mysterious and cooler sounding title of nightmen, as the only time that they were allowed to perform their dirty duties was under the shroud of night, and that really sucked. There were no flashlights, spotlights, or illumination of any kind. You just had to hope that the moon was shining brightly to light your way. Go. The nightmen would enter these cesspits and drain the contents using buckets and shovels. Excrement was loaded into barrels and carted off to be dumped near the river Thames. Don't worry, it was used as fertilizer later. Yeah. These men would be knee-deep, waist-deep, even neck-deep in this stuff, which had its own risks, the first and foremost being asphyxiation. Cesspits were often enclosed spaces with little to no ventilation, so the buildup of noxious and toxic gases was a very real threat. Although rare, a gong farmer could pass off from a lack of fresh air and drain the waste. Another risk was poor maintenance. Cesspits were typically drained as needed, which, depending on the size of the thing, could be up to 2 years between sloppy scoops. Since these pits were fat and rotted, it was common for stone walls to collapse in on the farmers while they harvested crops. Any scrapes or bumps would certainly get infected, which could only lead to a rapid death. but these high risks were met with high reward. Since the job was less than desirable, gong farmers made quite a healthy living, about 6 pence a day. Now, I'm not quite sure what that is in non-silly sounding money, but sounds pretty good. Problem is, though, gong farmers perpetually reeked from their labors and were only permitted to live in certain areas of the city, with most of the public actively avoiding them and, well, treating them like crap. Now, if you're looking for a soul-crushing, body-breaking job that pays next to nothing, you're an idiot. I could recommend that you apply for the occupation of chimney sweep. These services were all the rage in, you guessed it, England's Tudor period, but the job has existed for hundreds of years. Rapid urbanization led to the construction of a lot of buildings. Each one of them suffers needs a source of heat. You gotta keep them English toesies nice and warm during the miserable grey winter months until the arrival of the miserable grey summer months. So a lot of fireplaces and chimneys were built to meet that demand. You do know how a fireplace works, right? Make fire make heat and smoke go up through chimney and blow out the top. But all of that burning of wood and coal creates lots of icky, carbon-heavy, flammable deposits that build up within the chimney. Big problem, because if that's not properly cleared out, then things can just go, and there goes not only your house, but a few neighbors' houses as collateral damage. Well, the higher-ups didn't like the risk of their kingdom going up in smoke at any given time, so they mandated that chimneys must be swept at least 4 times a year or face heavy fines. Thus, the employment of chimney sweeps became critical. The problem, though, is that chimneys at the time weren't exactly designed for human entry and cleaning. Most flue networks in a building were grouped together on the roof, but could have sharp turns as they angled out towards their respective fireplaces or furnaces. To make matters even worse, regulations shrunk flue sizes down to as little as 9 by 9 inches. This made it nearly impossible for full-grown men to slip through the cracks. The solution? Children. Really young children. Adorable, wide-eyed orphans were yunked from poorhouses and taken on as apprentices called climbing boys, with opportunities to one day grow into master sweepers themselves, if they lived that way. If it wasn't obvious, chimney sweeping was extremely dangerous, especially for the little liberal lads. Boys as young as 6 years old were sent on chimneys and told to get scrubbing. The physical dangers were abundant, as several children had died from getting stuck or horribly burned from scaling the scalding bricks. Keep in mind that these fireplaces were almost always in use, so those chimneys were hot and ready like a carry-out pizza. Now, if the cramming didn't kill
Yo, our dudes, what's up?
Soot creosote, the organic carbonaceous
Welcome, thanks for joining. Sorry, I was a bit here engrossed and distracted. Yeah, I love custodians, man. They're so amazing.
But it actually wasn't your lungs that you needed to worry about. No, it was your balls. Scrotal squamous cell carcinoma, also known as chimney
Just giving it a little edge.
scrotal cancer, was a death sentence.
You know, gotta get some edge into those blades.
Easier into the narrow hot chimneys, often went commando. No shirt, no shoes, no pants, but all service. The constant exposure to soot and such led to the development of tumors on their nethers. Once developed, they were lucky if they had a few years left in them. Sure, your sack is out of whack, but man, that chimney's clean.
How you doing?
You've probably heard of the radium girls, young women of the workforce that would paint luminous numbers and hands onto timepieces in the early 1900s. Well, this is similar. Towards the end of the 19th century, matchmaking was a pretty lucrative business. Not like pairing couples up, but making literal matches. By the late 1800s, there were about 25 matchmaking factories across Great Britain, employing over 4,000 chaps and chapettes. The process, as with most industries at the time, involved working with some nasty chemicals. The flavor of the day here was white phosphorus, an unstable compound that burned fiercely when ignited. You know, perfect for the few seconds that you would need to set something ablaze. On top of being both easily ignitable and violently reactive with oxygen, it had the triple whammy of also being extremely toxic. Of all matchmaking jobs, roughly half were involved in the direct handling of white phosphorus.
Gotta have an edge on your sword, I always say.
Women, these women would come to be known as.
To be honest, I never said that in my life until now, but
These women were
you know.
tasked with packaging the dip matchsticks, with an entire workforce handling as many.
Today was very productive and fun.
Meeting the demand of the 250 million matches being burned in Britain every single day. Remember that fire is what got people through the day. Need to cook? Fire. Need to keep warm? Fire. Need to see in the dark? Fire. Need to strip your overhead? Fire. It was the biggest blessing humanity has ever discovered, and you can now summon it out of a little box in your pocket. The obvious problem is that fiddling with all of those fickle phosphorus fumes physically fucked you up. It was very common for both men and women to form phosphoric necrosis of the jaw. The condition, nicknamed Fossy jaw, developed after the long-term exposure to phosphorus fumes. Initial symptoms included simple toothaches, which evolved into complete tooth loss, abscesses, swelling of the gums, and complete necrosis of the jaw. To put it simply, your jaw rotted off. If you did get the jaw rot, there was about a 1 in 5 chance that the rest of your body would be rotting not long after from contracting an even worse condition known as death. In 1888, over 1,400 matchstick girls, fed up with this blatant disregard for their safety, decided to strike, demanding better pay, working conditions, and abolition of unfair fines and penalties. The strike lasted for 2 weeks before demands were met and accepted. 20 years later, in 1908, the British House of Commons completely banned the use of toxic white phosphorus in favor of the much safer and less toxic red phosphorus, which is what we use in matches today, but not in the match head, on the striking pad. So remember to light one up for the matchstick girls. If you think your job's exhausting, try hauling an entire frickin' ship up a river with your bros. These are burlaks, or barge haulers. They haul barges. Typically dirt-poor peasants just looking for enough coin to eat for a week, these men were tasked with strapping on a strap and using whatever strength they had left in them to pull in ships from the Caspian Sea all the way up the Volga River in the days of the Russian Empire. Since ship traffic was near constant thanks to strong trade, burlaks were in high demand to carefully guide the vessels up the Volga. But why couldn't the ships just sail up the river, you might ask? Because the Volga flows outward towards the Caspian Sea, and there were rarely favorable winds to propel a ship up the river, lest you risk beaching your entire ship on the banks. So why not hire a bunch of exhausted and desperate poor people to do the work instead? Whoa, slow down, fellas. There's no need for us to be Russian. Depending on the load size, burlak groups could range from just a few men up to 150 fellas pulling a single ship. But there was a moment of respite for these workers. See, one advantage to working in the Russian Empire was the cold winters. Can't exactly move ships upstream when the waterways are completely frozen over. So burlaks were seasonal, working dawn until dusk, thaw till frost. But since the combination of being poor and not working meant certain death, the men would pick up odd jobs in the winter to barely scrape by. Hey, I'll make a book. At the beginning of the 19th century, it is estimated that about 600,000 burlaks worked in the Russian Empire. But the evolution of ship technology and the invention of the steam-powered ship rendered the job obsolete. By the end of the 19th century, the burlak profession had vanished over the horizon. Now I know what you're thinking, so stop it. This has nothing to do with milking your own snake or giving little pinches to little snake nips, which don't exist. Snakes are mammals. The job of a snake milker was to extract their venom from their fangs. It looks cute, right? Think again. Snake venom was highly coveted for use in early warfare as a biological weapon, granting you the ability to proc tick damage over time to your enemies if you weren't able to finish them off yourself. Perhaps the best weapons of choice to get slathered in the stuff. Lethality of arrows varied greatly. Take one in the skull, yeah, sure, you're dead as a doornail. But take one in a less critical spot like an arm or leg, assuming you don't sever an artery, and you might just live to see another day. But that all goes out the window if the arrow tip was dipped in some venomous drip. Quite a few civilizations have been noted for using envenomed or poisoned arrows throughout history. You've got the Khoisan people of southern Africa who have been using poisoned arrows for thousands of years in hunting large prey, and the Hermetians who used viper venom against an invading Alexander the Great. But no army employed the use of snake venom better than the Scythians. Also duking it out against Alexander the Great, the Scythians developed their black plague poison for warfare, combining not only viper venom, but also putrefied human blood and excrement Even minor scrapes from their weapons are lethal. So on top of dealing with being envenomed, we also dealt with the horrors of gangrene and tetanus. So with all that said and done, yeah, snake milkers. Like I said, it was their job to wrangle and wrestle up enough snakes to meet the demand of entire armies. But luckily, this wasn't a time for catch and release practices. Kill the snakes, take their venom. That's the job. Of course, that is easier said than done. By nature, snakes are shy little fellas, pretty hard to find. Chances are you get struck before you even noticed one. One catch of their fangs is enough for it to be game over. Snake milkers were considered lucky if they even managed to survive a single round of collecting. I think it's time for a quick science lesson. Venoms can be sorted into three main types: neurotoxic, hemotoxic, cytotoxic. Yikes. Neurotoxins strike and destroy all your nerves. You're agonized and paralyzed, as you can observe. Hemotoxins target all your healthy blood, thinning down or clotting up, so now you're done for, bud. Cytotoxins focus on killing all your cells, so you can probably guess that you won't be doing well. Just avoid snakes, and you'll be doing fine. I know you fellas and fellas just love a good rhyme. So to close this chapter out, yes, snake milkers still exist nowadays, though only for medical research and developing antivenom rather than biological warfare. Or so we think. Imagine getting ready to charge onto a battlefield to either invade a country or defend your own. You see your fellow soldiers gearing up for battle with their trusty firearms. You're given a drum. Drummers, believe it or not, were a critical part of warfare in the days of yore. Since there were no such things as radios or more instantaneous methods of communication, drum boys were employed and trained to maintain order on the battlefield, signaling commands, attacks, retreats, and everything in between. Peaking in popularity during the American Civil War, drummer boys were typically in their teenage years or in adulthood, though some more famous drummer boys were much younger. Little Charlie King of the Union Army died in battle at the age of just 13, being the youngest casualty in the Battle of Antietam. Itty-bitty Johnny Clem ran away from home and was taken in by the Union Army as a drummer boy at the ripe old age of 9. Just a few years later, the little fella fought in the Battle of Chickamauga in 1863 at the age of 12, where he shot and killed a Confederate soldier. What you gonna do? Shoot? He was promoted to sergeant, eventually retiring from the United States Army in 1915 as a brigadier general. But that's a rare occurrence. In reality, it would have gone more like this. Despite what people may think, drummer boys did not lead troops into battle. That would be stupid. Instead, they would relay commands from behind soldier lines, though they were still known to be valuable targets. If you break the communication line, you break down the army. Outside of combat, drummer boys had a wealth of other responsibilities, such as carrying messages between units, assisting battlefield surgeons with amputations, carrying the wounded off the field, fetching supplies, or burying the dead. They very rarely carried weapons of their own, so if they had to defend themselves in the heat of battle, they were pretty shit out of luck. If you wanted to be one of the most influential people in all of England but don't have a drop of royal blood in you, you'd want to squeeze and speed roll for the groom of the stool, a job requiring you to get up real close and personal with the king or queen at the time. Look, we all have to go once or 12 times a day, so someone as prestigious and important as the king is going to need help doing so. I mean, imagine feeling the sudden urge to blow out your bridges, but you had to fight through said bridges to accomplish the mission. Grooms of the stool assisted the monarch with any labors regarding biological movements. This included helping the removal of clubbing, preparation of the lavish and luxurious royal shipments, and the removal of the splendiferous salads, but not before their proper examination. And that's right. Grooms of the stool were not only tasked with cleaning up the royal slurry, but making sure that the passings were healthy, taking notes of any abnormalities and appearance or frequency. These notes would be passed on to the king's personal physician to diagnose any possible ailments. That's not very helpful, is it? After the log was sent down the river, the groom of the school would also assist in the cleanup effort, either by handing the king his own personal cleaning cloth, or by taking up wiping duties themselves. Now, you might think that this job sucked, but it was actually highly coveted and well respected, as grooms of the stool had access to the king outside of the public eye, allowing for valuable private conversations. Commonly high-ranking nobles or politicians, grooms of the stool were known to have influence in many formal rulings, laws, or personal life. So that Anne Boleyn chicks out, right? The first documented groom of the stool dates all the way back to 1495 under King Henry VII. The role continued to evolve over the years to the title of groom of the stole, though they were more so referred to as either the gentleman or gentlewoman of the bedchamber, depending on the monarch in charge, with responsibilities eventually focusing solely on the king or queen's wardrobe. The position was held for over 400 years until being formally discontinued under King Edward VII in 1901. The silliest deaths in history. Sometimes it's your own pride that can get the best of you. This is Hans Seininger, and this is his beard. Hey, my eyes are up here. Looking like the wisest wizard in the world, Hans was a public spectacle in the 16th century and also a well-respected politician. Cause, I mean, come on, who are you gonna vote for? Majestic and marvelous beard boy Hans, or the lame and lackluster clean-shaven Franz? Und that is how I will be lowering taxes while simultaneously providing affordable healthcare and housing for all. Alright, where's your beard? I don't have one. But behind that big bushel of bristles beats a kind heart, one that legitimately cared for his town and its people. So much so that Hans was elected as mayor for 6 consecutive terms for the town of Braunau am Inn, a town that resides on the border between modern-day Austria and Germany. It's also the birthplace of another famous facial hair haver, albeit far less loved by history, but that's another story. Measuring in at over 4.5 feet in length, Hans's big-ass beard was his defining feature, and was certainly a testament to his patience and care in many aspects in his life. If you can brush your beard, you can untangle legislative issues. If you can oil up your whiskers, you can lubricate the political machine. So it goes without saying that cosmetology and political science are of equal value. At least from a college degree standpoint. However, Hans's biggest asset would be his downfall, quite literally. On September 28, 1567, a fire broke out in the town, which was a much bigger threat back then than it is today. Since the extensive firefighting tactics were just pathetic pails of water, a single small fire could reduce your whole town to cinders real quick. Hans, who usually tucked his beloved beard into a leather pouch for safekeeping and uninhibited travel, let his lusciously long locks whimsically equip a friend as he ran to help with the fire. Scuttling down some stairs in a panic, Hans had accidentally slammed a piggy right on his own facial pubes, causing him to slip and trip down the entire staircase. He snapped his neck, and the town was devastated. Not by the fire, but by the loss of their beloved mayor. Before being buried, the townsfolk had Hans's beard gently removed and chemically preserved, immortalizing his legacy. The forever facial hair is still on display in a museum in the town today. You know his ghost is pissed though. Ever have an extreme case of the sleepy ha-has where you find anything and everything to be complete comedic gold to the point of not being able to even breathe? Now try to imagine this soggy scoop of Cheerios doing that. This is Chrysippus, a rather influential Greek Stoic philosopher in the 3rd century BC. In case you don't peruse that corner of YouTube, Stoicism is the philosophy that you only ever need to focus on what you can control in your life. Anything reasonably outside of that control, Acutis Mutatis non operans, which is a pretty solid philosophy, especially in this age of doom and gloom social media designed to make you perpetually paranoid and pissed off. Chrysippus was also a huge proponent of logical reasoning, having created an original system of propositional logic, stuff like if, then, and or statements that we use to describe the world around us today. For example, if you are not subscribed to this channel, then you're dead to me. Simple logic. The basic idea is that any and all things happen for a reason. Well, I'm sure Chrysippus would have a hard time understanding the logic and reasoning surrounding his rather untimely death. According to legend, Chrysippus, at the fermented old age of 73, got trashed at a feast. In his lizard state, he had stumbled upon a donkey who was
end it
on
then.
figs.
Do you want to end it?
At least a 6.9 on the ancient Greek comedy scale, the masticated mule was a hilarious sight to behold, prompting Chrysippus to exclaim, quote, give the donkey some pure wine to wash down the figs. This added punchline sent the Lord of Logic over the edge. Chrysippus reportedly hurled himself into a fit of laughter so intense that he had collapsed, foaming at the mouth. Despite some nearby partygoers attempting to help him, he had knocked himself dead with his own joke. But the question is, can you actually die from laughter? Sure you can. It's rare, but medically possible. If you laugh your ass off to the point of it being an uncontrollable fit, that actually puts a lot of stress on your heart. So if you have a weak heart, you're probably going to exacerbate some underlying conditions, leading to a heart attack. You also have the possibility of losing consciousness if you lock yourself out of breath for long enough. But you have to hear or see something exceptionally funny for that to happen, so don't worry, you're safe here. Now, of course, this recount of events is debated by historians. The guy who documented this particular death was ancient Greek biographer Diogenes Laertius, who lived a few hundred years after Chrysippus' death, so he was far from an eyewitness. Diogenes nuts! On top of that, he also wrote an alternative, more mundane account of the comical death, simply writing that Chrysippus died of alcohol poisoning after drinking too much undiluted wine. But also needed to spice some things up for his readers. If there was ever proof that the universe has a cruel sense of humor, then it's the curious case of American lawyer and politician Clement Vallandigham. Though he resided in the Union state of Ohio during the mid-1800s, Clement was adamantly against the Civil War, calling it, quote, a wicked, cruel, and unnecessary war, which is fine, but being a member of the Copperhead faction of the anti-war Democrats, Clement was a very vocal Confederate sympathizer, speaking out against President Lincoln and the abolition of slavery, to which Lincoln was all and sent him to the South to live amongst his Confederate companions in 1863. Clement, who was clearly not about that life, snuck aboard a ship and shipped himself off to Canada before sneaking back to his home state of Ohio to perform rather inconsequential political mumbo-jumbo for the next few years. But after the war was over, Clement attempted to run on political platforms while still advocating for slavery. However, he suddenly switched his views with the Democratic New Departure policy of 1865, which basically 180'd the Democratic Party's stance on slavery, once they realized that it fell out of favor in the public's eye. So, being branded as a no-good slavery supporter for life meant the figurative death of his political career. Instead, he turned to a career in law, which would soon lead to his literal death. On June 17, 1871, Vallandigham met his demise while defending his client, Thomas McGeehan, a young fella accused of shooting and killing one Tommy Myers. Clement claimed that Myers had, in fact, not been murdered, but accidentally shot himself with his own gun while getting up to stand. Clement vowed that he could demonstrate this before the court, proving McGeehan's innocence. And so he did. Now, when reenacting a scene that results in someone accidentally blowing a hole through their own tummy, you want to make sure that you have safety measures in place that would physically prevent you from doing the same thing. Clement didn't do that. Instead, he had mistakenly used a loaded pistol. While demonstrating the scene as Myers, Clement attempted to draw the seemingly harmless firearm from his coat pocket as he stood up. And he blew a hole through his own tummy, just like Myers. Clement Vallandigham died just 12 hours later from his injuries. The verdict? Not guilty. McGeehan was acquitted and was a free man. Until he was murdered a few years later, that is. You can tempt death all you like, but eventually, he's gonna get what's his. That's what big old Bobby Leach found out in 1926. Born in itty-bitty Britain, England in 1858, Leach grew up to be quite the daredevil. Unfortunately, most of Bobby's early life is lost to time, completely shrouded in mystery. We do know that around the 1880s, he had left boring old England for a more exhilarating life in the States. Apparently an excellent swimmer, Leach eventually landed a gig as a professional high diver with the greatest show on earth, the Barnum and Bailey Circus. There, he performed daringly dangerous feats in front of thousands of eager onlookers. This had quenched the adrenaline-thirsty void in his life for a while, but eventually he retired from this circus life at the age of 50 in order to extend his life expectancy a bit. But that logic was tossed aside rather quickly, as in the early 1900s, Bobby decided to settle down as a humble businessman at Niagara Falls. Initially content with just opening up a restaurant, Leach noticed the ever-increasing tourists flocking from afar to see a bunch of water spill over a cliff. So, this gave him an idea. The daredevil was back. Between 1906 and 1911, Leach performed various stunts around the falls, including parachuting from the nearby Honeymoon Bridge to the river below. Over the years, Leach continued to push the envelope, coming up with more and more dangerous stunts to draw larger and larger crowds. Eventually, he faced his biggest challenge, the falls themselves. And on July 25th, 1911, entombed in a customized giant metal barrel, Leach took the plunge. and survived. Sure, he had gashed his forehead, broken his jaw, and all of his kneecaps, but he was still kicking. Bobby Leach became the second person to survive the trip, right behind 63-year-old Annie Taylor. After recovering in the hospital for several months, Leach became a celebrity. Over the next several years, he had plans to make a second bound over the falls, but it never came to be. Why? Well, because in 1926 he went and slipped on a dead orange peel, snapping his leg in half, which went and got infected with gangrene, ultimately killing him a few days later. Remember that death always gets the last laugh. Having served the shortest presidential term in United States history, you know something must have gone down. Well, it was President William Henry Harrison's health bar. The withering president had a pretty impressive career before assuming office. He enlisted in the U.S. Army in 1791 at the age of 18 and quickly rose to the ranks, serving in the American Indian Wars, which sought to expand U.S. territory further west against native tribes, which they did. Satisfied with his service, Harrison decided to retire from the military at 25 and tossed his head in the ring for a career in politics. Recognized for his leadership.
Alright, bye everybody. Thank you for joining. See you later, alligator.
As governor, with the goal of expanding that territory for statehood eligibility. One consequence